that we'll put up on the screen. Another question. It says, does Romans 14 verse 5 say that it doesn't matter what day you keep? And, Pastor, like in our radio program, we often get this question. What does Romans chapter 14 verse 5 talk about when it says one man esteems one day and another esteems every day alike?
Yeah. And you probably know that we were able to see the questions that came in before the program. Pastor Ross is going to take live hot questions from you in just a moment. So we're deliberately wanting to cover some of these common misconceptions and objections people come up with. As soon as you tell someone you've learned the Sabbath truth, it's amazing how many Christians will try to talk other Christians out of keeping one of the commandments. It is astonishing to me. But Paul is talking here, and he said, I want to start with verse 2, if it's okay. For one believes that he might eat all things, another who's weak eats herbs. He's talking about some are afraid to eat things that have been sacrificed to idols, and so they just eat vegetables. Let not him who eats despise not him that eats not. And let not him which eats not judge him that eats. God's received him. Sometimes we go to a Chinese restaurant. There might be a Buddha in the entrance with incense. Some very sensitive religious people will say, I can't eat in that restaurant because they got a statue of Buddha. I'll be participating in idolatry. Paul said, if it bothers you, don't eat it. Eat vegetables. If you've got faith and it's not going to worry you, eat it. Pray over your food. So that's the kind of thing they were talking about back then. And now here's the other issue. One man esteems, this is verse 5, one man esteems one day above another, another man esteems every day alike. Let each man be fully persuaded in his own mind. See, not only were some of the Jewish Christians very sensitive about eating anything in the Roman marketplace because it could have been sacrificed to an idol, they wanted all of the new Gentile Christians to celebrate the Jewish annual feasts. These are annual Sabbaths and other holy days, that not talking about the weekly Sabbath. And he said, don't judge your brother. One man regards one day above another. Another man regards every day alike. Let each one be persuaded in his own mind. I've never heard a pastor in a Sunday church stand up and tell his congregation, if you want to come Sunday, that's just up to you, however you feel. They never use that verse that way until they hear the Sabbath truth. Here he's talking about keeping of Jewish holidays. He's not talking about the seventh-day Sabbath. That's part of the 10 Commandments that predates creation. Now keep this in mind, friends. The Jewish ceremonial Sabbaths came after sin. They were written on paper by the hand of Moses. The 10 Commandments existed before sin. They were in the Garden of Eden. They were written on stone by God's finger. Two completely different laws. Yes, the Sabbath day does still matter.
Elon Musk's newest project could determine who will become extremely wealthy and who will get left behind. This project has nothing to do with Tesla or SpaceX. In fact, I believe this project could be bigger than both of those combined. It's called Project Omega, and it's about to start a massive wealth transfer like we've never seen before. It all started right here in San Francisco in this building behind me. And now,
interpreting and understanding. It's not significantly difficult to understand for those who are reading Romans chapter 14 on topics of judging one another. It seems pretty clear that we all kind of walk away from the text with the same understanding, shouldn't judge each other. However, some of the more some of the actual topic that's being discussed, the food, particular days, and the law is something that people walk away with not feeling like they understand what Romans chapter 14 has to say, or with an incorrect interpretation of Romans chapter 14. And so we're going to jump right in today. We're going to get into Romans chapter 14. This is the text that everybody sees, and this is what people talk about, saying the Sabbath. You can choose any day you want to Sabbath, or anytime you want to Sabbath, or you don't have to Sabbath at all. From this text here, Romans 14, 5 and 6. And this is what it says. It says, one person regards one day above another. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to just go to the NIV here because it butchers it. And we'll do the worst possible version to start off with. And then we'll undo that by showing you all of the reasons why this is a bad translation. Okay, one person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. This makes you think that this is about sacred days, holy days. It makes you think of the Sabbath, the holy day Sabbath. Whoever regards one day as special does so to the Lord. Whoever eats meat does so to the Lord, for they give thanks to God. And whoever abstains does so to the Lord and gives thanks to God. The first thing I'll say, starting right off the bat, is if Paul wanted to address the Sabbath and the Jewish holy day, and basically have an argument with those who have joined the Christian flock, Jews that might have joined the Christian flock, or Jews that are perhaps arguing against Christianity, he would have spent a considerable amount of time talking about the Sabbath, which we don't find in the entire New Testament writings of Peter or James or Paul or Jude. We just don't find this substantial conversation about the Sabbath. I mean, think about circumcision. Circumcision was a big deal. And there's a lot in the New Testament where they are interacting and arguing, and where Paul is dealing with the theology of circumcision. It's a big thing. And so what we're talking about right here, these verses, Romans 14, 5 and 6, this isn't even 2 full verses. This is 1.5 verses. If Paul was here speaking about the seventh day Sabbath being no longer something that you have to keep, I promise you he would have spent a considerable more amount of time. Well, I believe he would have spent my interpretation, my understanding is that he would have spent a considerable more amount of time talking about this. In fact, when you add up all of the verses that supposedly say, hey, you don't need to keep the Sabbath, or the Sabbath is not binding, or however you want to phrase it, I mean, you're looking here at Romans 5 and Romans 14, 5 and half of 6. So that's about a verse and a half. You're looking at half of a verse in Colossians chapter 2, verse 16. So you're up to about 2 verses. And then we're going to point to Hebrews chapter 3 and 4. But even there's no mention of the specific Sabbath day, except for in verse 9 of chapter 4. So, I mean, cumulatively, there are 3 verses that are hypothetically speaking to the Sabbath day in the New Testament. Now, Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, that would be an interesting one to make a video about, but it doesn't deal with doing away with the Sabbath day. A lot of Hebrews chapter 3 and 4 is focused on kind of a fulfillment of the Sabbath reality, the eschatological fulfillment of the Sabbath reality. the fulfillment of Sabbath rest in Christ and that sort of thing. And then Paul brings into the idea that you can experience this in the Sabbath day, like that these realities exist here now on earth through faith and in participation with the Sabbath day. Anyway, that's a great video for another time. I'm not talking about Hebrews chapter 3 and 4 today. We're not breaking that down. But what I'm trying to show you is that cumulatively, we're not talking about, Paul doesn't address the Sabbath day in very many verses, which makes one wonder, is he really addressing it at all? Is he trying to do away with it? Now, there's a lot of conversation about what to do with the law, the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue, the Mosaic Law. There's a lot of conversation about that. And how does law work in the New Testament? A lot of conversation about that. But specifically regarding the fourth commandment, I would go so far as to say there's not a single place in the entire New Testament that does away with the fourth commandment. In fact, there are multiple places that encourage keeping the fourth commandment the way it was meant to be kept. And you can read about those by Jesus. You can read about that in Hebrews. You can read about that in how to actually fulfill the law, Galatians 5, Romans. And this brings us to the next point. Romans, and well, before I move to the next point, let me just demonstrate other translations here so that you'll see this kind of, alternative view of Romans 5 and 6. Notice the word holy is missing. This is the NASB. So same manuscript says the NIV, but it's missing the word holy. One person regards one day above another. And now that's how it reads. One person regards one day above another. And the actual word here for regards is judge. One person judges one day above another. And the reason he uses the word judges, krino, the reason he uses it is because the topic is, the topic of this chapter is judging one another. And so he uses this word krino to keep with the theme of judging. And so he says, one person judges one day above another. Another judges every day alike. So judgment is taking place about days and what days are being judged. That's the question. That's the question that scholars literally have no answer to. In fact, almost all of your commentary on this text, unless someone's taking a hard position, is going to tell you that there's a lot of things this could be referring to. And at least half of the commentaries, people that have comment on this text, are going to tell you for sure that's not talking about the Jewish Sabbath, the seventh day Sabbath, or the Lord's Day, even those who believe that Sunday is Sabbath. This is not talking about that. You're gonna find that be a prevalent position. Not talking about that. Okay, but the ones who may include the Sabbath day. They're going to say you can't be sure that it's talking about the Sabbath day. In fact, here's the options of days that it might be talking about, and we also can't say that it's talking about all these for sure. It might be talking about these, or it might be talking about these, or a combination of these. The thing we know for sure is that nobody knows. Nobody knows what this is talking about. One person regards one day above another, or judges one day above another. Another judges every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He observes the day. He observes it for the Lord. He who eats does it for the Lord. What we're doing is we're establishing that what we do individually, what our conscience bears upon us, that's what we should be living out. And we shouldn't be judging each other about, and this is very important, shouldn't be judging each other about personal opinions. So this chapter is about judging each other on things that aren't moral imperatives, about judging each other on things that aren't clear in the scriptures, that God has not spoken about specifically. This is about things that are opinions, that people are holding opinions about, and they don't know exactly what's right or wrong. Have you been in that situation? Have you found yourself in situations where some person thinks this is okay, another person thinks this is not okay, and you're not sure whether it is or whether it isn't? And the Bible doesn't make a clear, thus saith the Lord on this topic. Well, what do? You make a decision and you walk forward in faith. And this is Paul's point. When you get to the end of the chapter, he says, he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because his eating is not from faith. And whatever is not from faith is sin. So the whole point is here is like in this gray area where we don't have a thus saith the Lord, just choose in faith to live, because the kingdom of heaven is not about these disputable matters. For the kingdom of God is not eating and drinking, opinions. The kingdom of heaven is about righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. So these disputable matters, these opinions, these are not what the kingdom of heaven is built upon. And we shouldn't make the kingdom of heaven these disputable matters. So what are the disputable matters? Well, the entire chapter is focused on eating. It's extremely tilted in the direction of talking about eating. It's not talking about days, all right? It's talking about eating. This is the subject matter of this chapter. It's talking about whether you should eat or shouldn't eat. And so let's just read through it a little bit. Now, accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. What does this mean, weak in faith? One person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. Now, this is not referring to some popular, trendy veganism or vegetarianism that exists now in 2021. This is referring to something quite different. This is referring to what was happening at their time. Now, at their time, it wasn't a question of whether you should eat meat or you shouldn't eat meat. Nobody's discussing vegetarianism versus meat eating. What they're discussing is whether or not you should, when you're walking through the marketplace and you see all this meat, whether or not you should buy meat and eat it, because a lot of the meat had been sacrificed inside of pagan temples, had been all offered as a ritual to pagan deities. And a lot of this meat that is in the marketplace, they're wondering, does this meat carry along with it some sort of spiritual omen, some sort of bad mystical juju, that if I eat this meat, like I'm going to like be, worshiping an idol with the people that were worshiping idols. And so people who Paul identifies as weak in faith, again, this is just a disputable matter. This isn't a substance of our faith. This is like, okay, people that Paul says are weak in faith are looking at this meat and saying, if this was offered to idols, and I can't tell the difference between what is or isn't offered to idols, well, I'm just not going to eat any meat. I'm just going to eat vegetables. The only thing I'm buying is vegetables, period, done deal. And then they would only buy vegetables. And Paul was saying, you don't need to spend your time arguing with those folks who are convicted that they need to like only eat vegetables. And that's the substance of this chapter. It's all about food. It's all about eating. It's all about judging one another and treating each other with kindness. Well, in the midst of this, okay, the one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat. And the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge the servant of another? All right, so don't judge. This person is making this decision between them and God. To his own master he stands and falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person regards one day above another, another regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. He who eats not, for the Lord he does not eat, and gives thanks to God. Now, at first, it looks like what we're talking about is Paul just transitioned into talking about days for 1.5 verses. But you can't divorce this from its context. The context is eating or not eating. And so what would you put this concept of eating or not eating in relationship with a day? Well, now you're talking about something that was very prevalent during the time, which is feast days and fasting days. Okay, this has to do with food and whether you would eat or whether you would not eat on certain days. Now, this gets into things like, do you still feast on certain festival holidays, or do you no longer feast on those days because those days are the same as every other day? In the same capacity, do you still fast on certain days of the week, which was part of Jewish tradition? There was certain days of the week, like the Pharisee comes in and he says, I fast 2 days a week, 2 times a week. This is some Pharisees would say you should fast on Wednesdays and Fridays. Others would say on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and others would say on Saturdays and Sundays. And so, like, there was these concepts of fasting and feasting that existed within the Jewish reality. And Paul is here addressing this kind of spiritual curiosity about whether or not I should eat meats. And it seems like he's addressing food in general. And here now he's addressing food in relationship to days, feasting and fasting. That seems rather evident in the text. One regards one day above another. One regards one as a feast day that should be kept, and you should feast on these days. Another regards every day alike. No, I can eat whatever I want on every day. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. Some people regard one day as a fasting day. Other people say, I don't have to fast on certain days of the week anymore. And then in verse 6, he says, he who observes the day, whether it's feasting or fasting, observes it for the Lord. And he who eats, right? We're still in context. This is the same sentence. It's commas. There's commas in it. And he who eats does so for the Lord. So if you're not fasting, you're eating for the Lord. For he who gives thanks to God, for he gives thanks to God. And he who eats not, he who fasts or chooses not to participate in the feast days and eats whatever he wants, for the Lord, he does not eat, and he gives thanks to the Lord. So stop judging each other about these trivial matters, these things that are matters of opinion. What we know is that the Sabbath is not simply a matter of an opinion. And if it was a significant theological point that Paul was trying to make, that you don't have to keep a Sabbath day, or it doesn't matter which day of the week you keep a Sabbath on, there would have been far more than a verse and a half that is in a chapter entirely devoted to eating and judging each other based on food preferences, than there is inside of this chapter. It makes it very difficult to make an argument that this has to do with the Sabbath. Let me give you another couple reasons why that is the case. If you look in the previous chapter, immediately preceding the substance here, there's 14 verses, right? And it's about behavior. It's about the way that you choose to live your life and the things that you choose to do. In fact, he gets to this one point in the text where he says, owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. First of all, he says, keep the peace by following the laws of the land. Then he says, owe nothing to one another except to, why is this doing this? Except to love one another. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. Paul is putting upon you a debt. A lot of people don't like this, but this is what Paul says. Owe nothing to anyone except this debt. You can owe this to people. You do owe this to people, and that is to fulfill the law. So wait a second. Paul is saying that you are to fulfill the law like Jesus fulfilled the law. Yes, you are to fulfill the law just as Jesus fulfilled the law. It's not a weird idea, because Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments. Not keep the letter of the law. Your righteousness needs to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Your righteousness needs to be like Christ's righteousness, which he puts inside of us, the seed of Christ. Christ is in us, we're in him, and his righteousness we get to walk out in our lives. And so there's an expectation, there's an owing, there's a debt that we have to our neighbors to fulfill the law, which is to love. This fulfills the law. Well, what law does it fulfill? Well, Romans chapter 13, verse 9 says, "For this, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet." That seems like the 10 commandments, at least 4 of them, 4 of the 10 commandments. And notice what it says. It says, "And if there is any other commandment," well, you can say the whole Torah or the whole Old Testament, the Tanakh, but at least you're going to say the surrounding commandments to those 4, which would include the 10. So here Paul is saying you owe it to your neighbor to fulfill the 10 commandments by doing what? Keeping the 10 commandments. And doing more than keeping them to the letter of the law, it's keeping the spirit of the 10 commandments, the heartbeat of the 10 commandments, the principles of the law. And here's the idea is, if you love your neighbor as yourself, and if you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, then you will keep the law, because love is the fulfillment of the law. Romans chapter 8 says that a mind without being in relationship with Jesus, without the Spirit, is at enmity with the law. But the mind of Christ in relationship with the Spirit is in harmony with the law, and you put to death the deeds of the flesh through this reality, this new creation in which you find yourself existing. So if there's any other commandment, it's summed up in this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Well, does the 4th commandment have anything to do with loving your neighbor as yourself? Absolutely. In fact, if anything, the first 3 commandments are about loving God. The 4th commandment is about loving God too, but there's a transition. There's a great glue that comes in with that 4th commandment, a beautiful connection. And that is that it talks about worshiping, loving, and following your creator, because he's your creator, your redeemer, your sustainer. This is who God is. And so you remember God, and you remember all he's done for you, and you remember him. But then there's also this relational horizontal aspect that comes with the Sabbath. So the Sabbath takes you from worshiping God, loving God, focusing on God, this vertical relationship, into a horizontal relationship where it says you rest and find your rest in God and with God, but then you also provide rest to everyone around you, your family, your children, your people at that time, indentured servants and slaves and things. These guys get rest. And that slavery was different. We're not going to talk about that today, but a different reality existed there. But you give them a Jubilee experience every 7 days. They get rest. And then outside of that group, you have even the animals that are getting rest. Your animals, your work animals, they get rest. And then you move to strangers that are in your home. They get rest. You are providing rest to, it's a relational experience. The same rest that you get on Sabbath, you are to give to others. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. If you're causing other people to work for you on a Sabbath day, well, you're not giving them rest. You are not loving them as you love yourself. You're taking rest, but you're not giving them rest. So here's the commandments summed up inside of Romans 13. Right after this, we find Romans 14, where Paul says, let's talk a little bit about opinions. Do you see what happened? We moved from expectations, behaviors, and the 10 commandments to opinions. disputable matters, matters that we should not be passing judgment of each other on these things. Just don't make fights where fights don't need to be made. There's no reason.
Think about what he said about the seventh commandment and how part of that commandment is to give rest to your family, your workers, the stranger who's in your gate, your beast of burden. It's moral. When you have people under your care, you have to give them a day off. That's part of it. That's part of the morality of the fourth commandment. And so think about what Paul says in chapter 14, right after he just gives the discourse on how you love your neighbor, and he quotes the 10 commandments. And if there be any other commandment, obviously that would include, because if you've broken one, you've broken them all. Whoever teaches men to keep the least of these, right? Well, so in Romans 13, he's just listed the commandments as being the fulfillment of the law because you love your neighbor. Like you said, you would have to give them a day off or you would not be loving your neighbor according to God's law. It says in Romans 14, regarding what days he's talking about, he says, each one treateth every day alike. So what if so I treat every day as a Sabbath? That would mean you're lazy and you're not taking care of your family, and he says elsewhere you shouldn't be able to eat. Or if you kept every day not holy, you wouldn't be providing rest to those around you. That alone tells you it absolutely is not talking about the Sabbath, period. If you have an understanding of what the law is about, a right understanding, and you just think logically, he's not saying you don't have to provide people rest or that God's done away with the commandment. It's talking about things that are disputable, things that God has not laid out. That's why I laugh when people say, if you don't follow what God has laid down, and what God's laid down is you don't keep his commandments of love. They're so mistaken. It's sad. Deluded.